Let's talk about students with disability, because this is one of the complaints I hear most often, is that all these tests are biased towards kids with special needs. So what do you think people mean when they say that these tests are biased against kids with special needs? Well, the way that we ensure tests aren't unfair to those with special needs is through the accommodation process. In theory, this is supposed to level the playing field. Most of us know of many accommodations given to classified and to 504 students, such as separate location and time and a half to take an exam, as well as a lot of others that are given out like candy in some cases. You know, if you have an IEP, then you're going to get all these accommodations whether you need them or not. So if an accommodation is given that it's meant to match the disability, bias should be eliminated. Yet, I'm not so sure that a great deal of thought is given to this process in some instances. In my experience, and it's being a special educator for 15 years, and then being an assistant principal for 6, and then a principal for 10, is that if a student gets classified, then people just check off a menu of accommodations, whether they need them or not. And of course, that's just my experience, but my wife, who happens to be a middle school assistant principal and who chairs a lot of child study teams, is often challenged, or she often challenges the educators to saying, why does this student need a separate location if being distracted is not one of their issues? Oh, well, you know, so in her case, it's really tough to get an accommodation because you have to show that the disability, that the accommodation will level the playing field for the disability. Okay, so so that's how we ensure an absence of bias. So these are the ways that we can modify a student's test-taking situation: by the presentation, by the response, the setting can change, or the timing and schedule. But remember, these are accommodations, and they are not modifications, which are changes to the test itself. So these are accommodations, and you need to match them to the disability, not just give them out. If a student is not distractible, then they don't need a special location. If a student can finish a test within the limits, then they shouldn't get time and a half. So it's something to give some thought to if you're part of a child study team. All right, I added this chart so you could look at it, and it shows the percentage of New York State students with disabilities who reached proficiency in 2006 and 2007. I think this is proficiency in English. I'm not sure. Oh, no, math. This is math. And I thought it was interesting how the percentage decreased steadily to the 8th grade. The good news is that at each grade level, the number is increasing, yet my theory that the longer you stay in special education, the further you get behind, seems to be borne out by this graphic. All right? Well, in theory, all the kids should be identified here. Okay? If we kick in our response to intervention, then kids should be identified almost immediately when they get into school and start struggling. Okay? In the old days, or even in some school districts now, students aren't identified until they failed for a couple of years, so they're not identified till the 3rd grade. So that may be one reason why you see it higher in the 3rd grade. But I do think it's disturbing to see this percentage of kids receiving proficiency decrease, percentage of special ed kids decrease the closer they get to 8th grade, the further they get along. So I just thought that was this is an interesting graph, something to think about and chew on. You know, is special education a holding tank for students with disability? Remember that discussion board we had way back in the beginning? Well, this is why I had that discussion board, because of this statistic. Okay. I'm editing this part of the video because since I originally made this, No Child Left Behind has now gone by the wayside. We now have the Educating Students for Success Act, or ESSA, and that is giving much more power back to the states on how they track students, how they do accountability. But many of the things have stayed pretty much the same, and as far as I can see, New York State doesn't plan to change a great deal about the way ELLs are identified. ESSA still requires districts to include ELLs and MLLs in accountability systems. And they also require identification and exit criteria as well as timelines for proficiency. So you just can't place kids into your program and let them flounder. There has to be timelines, there has to be a program, and through all this, they've given more control for that to the state, but New York State has typically had more regulations for monitoring those kind of things than they're required to do. I know that they are required to report, and I'll show you this. This is a Excel spreadsheet that all districts are supposed to send in, and you can see this is Form 2, where they have to identify those newcomer ELLs, those with an IEP and without, developing ELLs, long-term ELLs, and SIFE students. Those are ones with interrupted or inconsistent educational experiences. So that's a category I had not been familiar with, but it is now something that has to be reported to the state. You can see there are other forms here as well. This is total number of ELLs identified in your district. This is the form I just mentioned. This is enrollment with number of IEPs by school building, enrollment by school building again by program, and I think there's a couple more enrollment, another enrollment by program subgroups, and this would be the number of teachers, certified teachers that are available to support ELL. So you can see that there's a lot of paperwork to be done, even after No Child Left Behind has gone by the wayside. Let's talk about some issues with English language learners, or as they're called, the government calls them, limited English proficient. Unlike special education students, where we can avoid bias with accommodations, it's not the case with English language learners. And one of the problems is that there are inconsistent regulations and procedures for classifying a student as LEP. In many instances, the number of English language learners in a school is too small to count as a separate group, and I mentioned that. Rhinebeck High School, where I was a principal, that was the case. A bigger problem would appear to be the instability of English language learners. As soon as you get one group of LEPs close to proficiency, they move out, and another low-functioning group moves in. So this is the real issues for large and small cities. So I mentioned that in the previous slide. Popham reports that there's also a problem with the technical quality of the tools used to determine adequate yearly progress for LEPs. I thought this graph was interesting. It shows the difference between limited English proficient and non-limited English proficients on the 2001 and the 2002 ELA exams in New York State. You can see that the limited English proficient students have a ways to go to reach level 3 and 4. Okay, so you can see here that 90% of kids that aren't LEP are achieving it at level 2 and 4, but only 48 or 56% are achieving there for limited English proficient. And you can see that level 4 and level 3 are way down, 14% to 62%. So we definitely have a ways to go. The last thing I wanted to mention, not only because it's a true-false question on the quiz, but the reason that all this accountability has come about is because that English language learners, special ed students, they were all allowed to disappear because they were put in with the average. So if you have 3,000 students and 150 of them are special needs or 50 of them are ELLs, they can just disappear with the average. Oh, this school district is doing very well. But because in 2000, the year 2000, the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans issued on May 20th, or May 2000, a report asserting that state accountability officials allow Hispanic youngsters to become invisible inside the very system charged with educating them. And that's a very powerful comment, because that's what brought about the disaggregating of special needs students, of English language learners, and other subgroups where districts who may look good because they have their average scores are very high, they had to start looking at their populations and saying, okay, what are we doing to make these students achieve? So that is why this all came about. And you'll notice that it's in 2000, and it wasn't until 2001 that No Child Left Behind came into effect. And then 14 years later, we have educating the ESSA Act. The name always escapes me. Educating Students for Success Act came about. So there's been a lot going on since the year 2000, and I think that report had a big effect on bringing to light subgroups. Okay, so what are some recommendations for dealing with ELLs, English language learners? Well, the last thing I wanted to share with you is at the end of Popham's chapter on bias, he notes that the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans makes some recommendations for the assessment of limited English proficient students. The first is that translated tests not be used with English language learners. So think about that. The reason for this is that most assessments have not undergone reliability or validity studies with a translated test. So when you translate a test, you're getting the translator's version of the test, not necessarily the test maker's version of it. So think about that. That's why we don't encourage that. The second recommendation is equally logical, that the Spanish versions of tests need to demonstrate that they are equivalent. So if you have a Spanish version of a test, it has to go through the same kind of validity and reliability testing that the English version does. And I know that's the case in some of the bigger tests, but it's something you need to look into or be careful about. And the third thing I chose to highlight is the use of interpreters should be discouraged for the same reason that a translated test shouldn't be used. So you're getting the version of the interpreter or the translator, not the version of the test maker. So there's several more recommendations listed in Chapter 4, but I felt these three were the most important and worth pointing out to you. So that's the end of this session, and I will. Oh my goodness. And I will be back